Well, do you want to tell us your origin story as a group?
So we were all 4 friends at McGill studying together, and I think it was Alexa who suggested that we all get together and play, like the 4 of us, because she and I had sort of played with various others in different combinations, but never this exact formation. So we just decided, yeah, let's just do some concerts together, and then it just sort of took off from there.
Nice.
Yeah.
And we've always sort of had in the background the fact that we are 4 women performing. So sometimes, you know, when we do interviews, for example, that's often something that people ask about is, oh, you're 4 women, like, what's that about? Is that on purpose? You know, how do you feel? It's 4 women performing, and I think that sort of led us into wanting to do this Virtuosa series about historical women performers.
Yeah.
Not to mention that those part of the interviews were often very frustrating. I'm sure you can imagine, because we were not, that wasn't our, I mean, we never, I mean, of course we identify as that, but it wasn't our
Objective.
To be 4 women that,
We
we
didn't want to be a girl band, per se.
we were just making music, and we had other things to talk about with the programs that we were presenting, and people just wanted to focus on the point that we were women, or you know, make sometimes inappropriate comments about that, or you know, leading it in kind of like a sexy way instead of you know, about the music, which was always very frustrating. And finally, it was like, well, you know, obviously it's rare, and there's a need to highlight more of that, and so then we embraced it, I guess.
I think we came up with the idea for dedicating a series to women composers and performers after coming back from a tour that was particularly frustrating in a few regions and a few interviews that felt rather sexist, and you know, it was very obvious that we were 4 women there with no men. And so we were coming back in the tour, after the tour we were coming back in the van, and we were talking about what kind of projects we wanted to do, and we're like, well, okay, we're going to do a series about women. And so we started researching not only women composers but also women performers, because men would also often compose for specific people in mind, and many of those were women.
I think the idea of like really focusing specifically on women performers was exciting to us, because it's something that we could directly relate to. And I think, you know, there has been so much emphasis about women composers and, you know, all of the fantastic work they do, but, you know, there is this aspect of being a performer as well that I think in many ways is separate from being a composer. And I think also that sort of experience of going through this tour and having people, you know, maybe point out that we're women in not so nice ways, there was that. But then there was also experiences where, you know, other women would come up to us and say, oh, it's so fantastic what you do, and, you know, you're such a role model for young women that they can, you know, have a career in this field. Which I think, I mean, I felt like, well, of course they can, you know, because that's what we're doing. But maybe that's not obvious or apparent to everyone. So I think it was a sort of an enlightening experience to have that sort of highlight on both sides, you know, the good and the bad.
And even women, like the same kind of thing, but women coming up to us after a concert and saying, you know, not just like it's great what you do and you're a role model, but like, they felt as audience members or, you know, people that frequented the series that they could come and connect with us in another way. You know, saying it's so good to see a group of women. Yeah. It's, you know, kind of like they're able to infiltrate this club because we did.
Yeah. And it's interesting that often the places where we received the most negative comments were also the places we received the most positive comments.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah.
I love the focus on women performers because I think, especially in early music, when composers are writing for prominent women performers, and especially this comes up in opera and singing, the person who's performing, you know, that has a big role in the compositional process, what kind of things they're good at, and, you know, some of these performers that you featured also wrote and hosted salons and sort of had curated collections and stuff. And I think that's so cool to think about the role that women performers play in the creation of music. That you're able to see women as complete musicians who contribute to music on every level. You know, composition is one level, but they're also bringing musicians together, and they're also inspiring other people to write works for them. So that's cool.
There's also this insight into how people played, since there were all these women, all these women that were inspiring certain pieces, either writing them or inspiring them. So now we can imagine the style of these particular performers and guess at why they, even if we don't really know them now, why they were a big splash then.
Yeah, I think I remember reading that Madeleine Sirman was this violin virtuoso, and when she went to England, she made a big impression because there were virtuoso women harpists and pianists. Those were it was okay for women to be good at those, but a virtuoso violinist who was a woman, that was crazy and weird. And and then it made her sell really well because people were like, ooh. I thought that was interesting. So was Virtuosa, would you say that's the first major project you've done that had women musicians as a main focus?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we started with just one concert. I guess that was our season before this past one. And we just enjoyed it so much. And there was a lot of music that we weren't able to include in that concert that we had looked at. So that's sort of what gave us the impetus to make a larger project out of it with our whole Virtuosa season, this past season. So 3 concerts with a more sort of focused lens on specific women and specific musical milieu. And then also our upcoming recording and this video series.
One thing that's particularly been really fascinating throughout this Virtuosa research process has been seeing the different ways of how these women were able to practice music, and whether they were only allowed to do it in their abbey room and composing for themselves, or whether they were published. And it's very interesting too to see the progression from the early Baroque, when it was less common and less encouraged and more frowned upon, throughout the classic, where it was sort of a novelty and that filled concert halls because it was a woman performing on violin, through the Romantic, where women had full careers and were often quite famous.
Well, what about someone like Clara Schumann, who is not super well known, but well known enough now? Like, how does she? I don't know how she fit in.
I've been interested in Clara Schumann and kind of have been spending some time in that world in the past few years, and for me, the reason I find it so intriguing is tapping into this the persona of someone who is in front of an audience in the public eye, a woman, I should say, in the public eye, and then how that translates to what I do, or how I think of music making today. So I wonder, how has that been for all of you this past year now, having gone through it and lived with it for...
I think it's very interesting to think about the performer, sort of the voice of the historical performer, as opposed to the composer. Because often, let's say you're playing Bach. You say, I want to, get to what Bach had in mind, and it's this kind of almost abstract idea of, the composer's intention. But for example, when I was playing some of the solo harpsichord music of Elisabeth Clochequet de la Guerre for this project, and recording the chaconne, it was like, wow, it's not just that she composed this, or I'm trying to get in touch with her compositional ideas, but she physically played this piece. And that's a sort of a very different thing to have in mind. And actually sort of inspiring of confidence, I would say, because she played the harpsichord and I play the harpsichord. Like, we're both sort of we have the same materials. It's not like trying, it's not as far away as imagining, the composer. It's like, she played this music and I play this music.
And we were talking about this the other day at Gili, when we were talking about, we're at this piece by Felix Mendelssohn, The Song Without Words, at least written for Lise Christiani, which is not the composer, but how how did she play it? She's described as a very elegant performer. So how can we, there's all these, agitato parts, but, and we have all these recordings of many wonderful performers playing it. But what could we do that maybe reflects this other reality of like an elegant performer throughout all of that, and how would this person that's elegant and charming and really tuned into your heart instead of a kind of a virtuosic performing, how would that affect the piece? How can we think from this other perspective? And we're thinking not just even if the composer and the performer were the same person, but yeah, it's a different way of thinking, a different way of imagining the music.
Yeah.
Well, for me, it affected me quite a bit because as we explored, as we tried to find flute players from the
It's particularly difficult.
yes, it is, because we really weren't allowed to play the flute, and we can name one or two women in the up to the end of the 18th century that played flute, and unless I were one of the anonymous orphans or students at La Scadella della Pietà, I would not have been able to play my instrument, which made me feel very sad.
Yeah. There's also the physical aspect of playing these instruments too. I mean, there's the issue of the end pin or the cello, and even how a woman would hold a cello, given the kind of clothing that she would wear. And I mean, certainly with the violin, like again, the same with the flute. I mean, it was considered just completely improper for women to play the violin, being that it was such a masculine instrument. And so, from a performance perspective, and especially a historical performance perspective, we study and we put all of this weight on these historical treatises that were written about how to play these instruments. And, they were all written by men, because that's who played these instruments. But it does make me wonder if women were allowed, or if it was acceptable for women to play these instruments, how would this have affected what we know as technique for our instruments to this day? And even things like about how to move your arm, how to hold the instrument. I mean, a man's physical body is very different from a woman's. And I think all of these things have impact on how you play, and that's really given me a lot of food for thought in terms of how I approach music in general, violin playing in general nowadays.
There are a lot of forums. I don't know if this would actually be appropriate to put on the video, but just in case. There are a lot of forums in which women are talking about, for cello, like modern cello or whatever, but they're talking about how to place the instrument, because it's actually, depending on who you are and how you're built, it's really hard to find a good spot to put your cello when you're a woman on your chest. It's like this other difficulty. But then, when you think about the fact that, as women, we often end up talking about our clothing, it's just ingrained, we grow up thinking about this more. It's like more important socially for us to be thinking about how we're going to be dressed for a concert or in public or whatever. But, at that time, it wasn't just how a woman was dressing, it was a man was dressing in a different way than now. But we never think about how his clothing would have affected how he was playing then too. So that could be, just as soon as we start to kind of delve into the different things, or the different ideas or different perspectives of a historical woman playing these instruments and this music, we can also start to think of another perspective that has nothing to do with our gender, but that we wouldn't have bothered thinking about, because at this moment in time, it's still important socially, but it has a less of an impact or less of a focus.
I've certainly found in singing that, whenever I've dived into Fanny Mendelssohn or Barbara Strozzi vocal music by women who sang their own compositions, there's something about it that feels very natural in my voice, in a way that sometimes contemporaneous music by men composers doesn't. And especially in the 17th century, I love to think about the performance context for women. There's a Barbara Strozzi piece in which the lyrics are the, great ones they love you and they leave you. And it's very likely that she performed these pieces herself. She would have accompanied herself on the gamba in contexts where there were a lot of men, and she was potentially some kind of sex worker, in which she was offering sort of music and conversation in addition to other things. But I love this, you know, the imagining that, like, singing this song that's sort of calling out some of the romantic tendencies of men, important men, and the kind of power that is in being a performer who's able to sing that to people. And then there's also a lot of convent music, and the performances for that would be mostly behind a grill, so the nuns were not visible, but like big dignitaries would come visiting. There was a lot of tourism for these nuns who sang, and often sang compositions of their own. So in performing music like that, it's really interesting to think about like being heard but not being seen, and the kind of reputation that you're creating for your convent and even for your city with your performances. So I've enjoyed thinking, it's definitely affected how I think about what I embody when I'm on stage. So you were saying that a lot of the like method books and sort of things for playing in salon context and stuff, the primary target audience is women.
Yeah, I mean, so this is where the keyboard realm differs from kind of the discussion we had with violin or flute or cello. I mean, this is an instrument that is historically associated with women.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when you think, I mean, the name virginal, that's where it comes from. So all these tutorials and method books that were being written for amateur keyboard players, of course, boys and men could play as well, and of course they did. But the target audience was certainly women, and it is important to keep in mind that for I guess that's what we were talking about earlier, pieces like sonatas, when written by Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, all these, the big guns, they were either dedicated to women, or if not clearly dedicated to it was mostly women who would be playing these pieces. And from the perspective of a historical performer, it's incredibly intriguing to try and inhabit that space.
Mm-hmm. I think so. I am now conscious after that I'm part of this continuous tradition of music in women in music, especially as a singer. I know that probably if I accidentally time traveled to the past, I could probably get by as a singer. And we're all part of it. But I didn't learn that in my musical education. I had to find that out on my own. And I think it's fair to say that for young men in our institutions of musical learning, it's easier for them to feel like they have access to being part of a long-standing tradition, to being in a line of, say, composers or performers or string quartets that are, overwhelmingly male, and you could go through a musical education without knowing that some of them were women, in fact. So I think that's another reason that the work that Infusion does and that we're all doing in our careers is really important, is that we've gained this knowledge about past women composers and musicians of all kinds, and then we're able to sort of embody that and bring that to life today. And this just sort of has the potential to open up a world of knowledge for younger women that they too are part of the tradition. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I wanted to bring up was I do sometimes when I read stories about women from the past, there are absolutely stories of abuse, sexual, harassment and exploitation for, young singers, all kinds of things. And I can identify very closely sometimes with some of those stories. We're still in a musical community in which various kinds of sexual misconduct are rampant, and they've certainly affected my career choices at a number of turns. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and to talk about the ways in which valuing women's contributions to music over history and creating spaces where women feel safe and valued and being public about that, which they don't have to be all women groups, but often, it's great. That is a situation in which women can often feel safe.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that you've done that with Infusion.
I think that's such a good point and an important one, because I think if there's anything that I felt really strongly in doing all this research is that the same struggles that these women faced, 100, 200 years ago are mirrored to this day. And, that's not to say that there of course there's been progress for women, but we can always read about, harassment or prejudice and find a common thread or something that we can relate to. And so I think that part of why I feel so passionate about this project is that I think it's important. It's important to acknowledge women of the past as well as the present who have been championing for themselves, And I was thinking about this the other day, how it's a really important topic of discussion nowadays, being a woman in any professional field and what it means to be a woman. And so, you are often asked or, hear about other women being asked about what is it like to be a woman musician or a composer or anything, a woman, anything. And, I know that a lot of women feel like, well, I'm just a person, I am just a professional and I happen to be a woman.
Limiting to be defined by your womanhood.
Yes, absolutely.
You never it's not, we didn't ask for that. It's part of one's identity and we, of course, interact with it and value it and cherish it. But there are other parts of our musical identity and public identity that we are more than one thing, So, yeah.
I think different women, just like in any professional field, women make different choices about the extent to which being a woman is part of their professional and artistic identity. And we see that throughout history as well. I think there are examples of women composers who had circumstances in which they didn't necessarily face a lot of adversity or resistance, like Elizabeth Jacquet-Laguerre was a child prodigy, played for the king, very popular, and she just played a lot of music. And in her music, I don't think that I don't feel super powerfully that there's a lot of themes around womanhood. Although the cantata that we did together, the aria, it's about Ulysses, but the aria that has the most musical space is sung by Minerva, so I think that's cool. But for instance, with Antonia Bembo, she went out of her way to choose texts that were by other women in her community. There's a Barbara Strozzi piece that sets a text from telling the story in the Metamorphoses of a woman who was raped and her tongue cut off. And then at the end she's turned into a nightingale so that she can sing again. There's a lot going on there with women's voices and the ways in which they can be cut off or overpowered by men. I'm someone who I will never stop talking about what it has been like for me to be a woman in this community, because it's often been quite difficult. But in other ways, it's really shaped me as an artist. And now I think I bring to all my performances, and especially my performances of music by women and music associated with women, this personal identification with the struggles that women have faced for many hundreds of years. Yeah.
Working with, and for me, at least in my other work, obviously working with a lot of women and a lot of men. And it used to be a thing. I would be asked specifically, when I was the only woman, what that was like. And I always found that so frustrating because I never thought about it. Because in this particular group, it really wasn't an issue. My voice was heard all the time. I had like an equal, equal respect amongst my colleagues, and this I have in the present still with this particular group. And so I never thought about it, and I found it very frustrating because, in my whole professional life and educational life, all of those things we kind of, at a certain time, that is not now, I hope, but we tried to ignore it. We didn't try to bring it up and say, this is a thing that is going on. We just kind of, stuff that down and be like, well, if I am different, if I am more forceful or more strong in the way I speak, if I change myself, people won't treat me in this way. People will respect me in a different way. And then people would still ask, and eventually it was like, well, it was kind of, there's like this resistance to that title, and eventually it's kind of the same thing that happened with the ensemble, with Infusion Baroque. Eventually we said, well, let's take this identity. And at a certain point, someone said, what is it like to be, the only woman? And I was like, well, I don't think about it, I don't notice. But then actually I was like, I thought maybe that's not fair to myself and to everyone else to be discounting this. Maybe it needs to be said.
Well, it can be very empowering, to look it straight in the face and then see what it does for you.
I love Clara Schumann, and I want to ask you about her, but one of the first sort of tip-offs for me that there's a lack of acknowledgement of women composers was in my college music history survey class, and she was never mentioned in class, and there was a set of notes.
Schumann was never mentioned?
No.
That's my fact. Wow. She's the most famous. One of the more well-known.
The woman.
Yeah. there was a long set of notes to study, and the name Clara Schumann appeared once, and it said Clara Schumann, wife of Robert and supporter of Brahms. That was it.
Okay.
And, so I thought it was so strange that you could go through an entire class and not know even that she was a famous performer. And I wonder if so she had this amazing performing career.
Spectacular.
Yeah, so can you talk about her as a performer and composer?
Well, I mean, the fact that, it's true, I think in many cases, if anyone has heard the name Clara Schumann, it's always associated with Robert Schumann, and then sometimes you might have heard her compositions before, but it's always, the names are, and as they should be, it was a big love story and a very important part of her life. But during their lifetime, for many years, she was the more well-known of the two, and she was, with much more potential to bring in, the money to support the growing family. And she had this phenomenal career from a very young age, well before she met Robert Schumann, and it continued after his death as well. She had such one of the longest careers, consecutive careers, and it's maybe 60 years that she was kind of on the public stage performing and touring.
Wow.
Yeah, really to the doorstep of the 20th century.
Wow.
It's and supported a family. Had this, her own personal, feminine life. So she's I find her continually fascinating. Because there's all these different aspects to her life. She's more than one thing. She's a performer. She's a virtuosa. She's a wife, a mother, a supporter. Of this new avant-garde music, this Brahms, and his ilk. And also, was a very important figure in kind of the music industry of her time. Yeah.
Do you think that her fame sort of helped make it more acceptable for women to be on stage as performers? Do you think she inspired other women?
Yeah.
Or
I imagine it must have been. I think there's something. There are always a few, but kind of the odd woman that, right? It's not that it was never around, I guess there's some, the stars had to be aligned in some way for those odd women to be able to succeed in that business. And it's true that, I mean, during kind of, so we're talking 19th century, 1830s and onwards, those were the years when, I mean, those realms were somewhat opening up. So, I mean, she was a part of that, perhaps a cause, but also part of the whole process. Yeah, so, you know, it can't necessarily point to, but, I mean, when you think of her class, her studio that she taught kind of in her later years, so she's already kind of an older woman in the 1870s and 1880s, and there were plenty of, you know, women that came to study in her class in Frankfurt where she taught. But the same was true in, you know, the studios of Franz Liszt and his. Yeah. I mean, there are quite a few kind of, you know, women who came to study, and it's from their accounts that we also know so much of, you know, what they were focusing on, and things to do with instruments and, you know, repertoire and, you know, all these other things, interesting things.
I mean, I think it's also, do you think it's safe to say that every woman who took the stage in the 18th and 19th centuries was a trailblazer in their own right, and they sort of paved the way for more to follow, just because it just wasn't done before. And, you know, in doing a lot of this research on violinists, I see, when I read about any female violinist from either of those centuries, they always say, like, she was a pioneer, she inspired more women to pursue music, and, you know, and so I think that they were all sort of doing the work, you know, to bring it more into the accepted sort of realm of society. And so what I feel like Clara Schumann, I think, is, you know, an amazing and fantastic figure, and she is more well known than maybe some others today. And you know, and I wonder, she deserves all of that, all of the reputation, and I think others do too. And you know, so it's actually really fun to go back and read about more women that were doing great things back then.
Something that I've learned in doing research about women musicians in the past is almost always they're way more than I think. One of my favorite factoids about Barbara Strozzi is that she never married, but she had 2 children, and she owned a house in Venice in the 17th century. And, you know, if you'd asked me, was it possible for an unmarried woman to have children and own a house in, you know, the 17th century, I would have said, no. And there's the story of Antonia Bembo, who is from Italy, and through methods that aren't totally known to us, escaped from her married life and her children to France, where she lived out the rest of her life alone, or in a small religious community. And I think there are a lot of different ways that women were able to access situations where they could compose or could become successful as performers. And, you know, Clara Schumann had one way in which she, you know, studied from a young age and was a virtuoso, and then became associated with Robert Schumann and decided to promote his music, etc., etc. But there are so many other different circumstances. You know, it's really kind of flabbergasting. The women were able to access this. I think it's easy to look back at the past and see, you know, the inequality that's existed for a long time, and assume that there was an extreme scarcity of women who were succeeding at music. But in reality, while of course there was a certain amount of scarcity, a lot of it is that we just don't know about it. It hasn't been well recorded, and that it hasn't been well studied, analyzed, and put into the musical discourse.
It's a source of comfort for me. I mean, I find, of course, I mean, it's wonderful to think of, you know, the revolutionary aspects of these women in music historically and now. But it's all, I mean, women have always been in music. Always. And so are we, and it's just, it feels right, you know, we're just, you know, taking our rightful place. We're doing what we've always done, you know, in the same way that, you know, with the piano being associated historically with women, I feel, you know, this is this is my instrument.
Yeah.
I'm meant to play it. So, and now as I live my life in this century, that kind of sense of continuity that is totally, my invention. It's just something that I feel for myself. But it's nice to think of yourself kind of in the bigger picture, a longer line of people who've been doing things perhaps very differently than the way we do them. But kind of a continuity of sorts.
There's I mean, we can think of in that exact same vein, we think, sometimes we get this idea that, yes, there were women doing things in secret, that you're supposed to be nice and fit in this box and all of that, but like Anna Amalia, who was quite rebellious, there were lots of women that were being rebellious and continued their lives like that, and with the violin, with the cello, with the gamba, with a bass gamba, which still holding between your legs with this giant skirt to try and, there were all of these women that were, against the rules. Then it's not like at one point one woman was like, no, I want to, I'm gonna do it. It's no, there was always this pushback, and it makes me wonder. There are always, even now, these different, this notion of privilege that's at play, and it makes me wonder. I don't know if it's fair to say at what level of privilege these women that we do know about, or that were more successful than others. Did this come from the fact that they were associated with royalty, or could it have been, were they able to become these spectacular musicians without this sense of privilege? And it's the same thing that happens now. Of course, we have different opportunities depending on who we are and where we are, but it makes me wonder at what, what if these people in their places of privilege just didn't push, extra hard for the future.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I have my favorite, I drew a diagram in my notes, I'm so proud of it, it's a little circle. But I think, for me, it seems like there's this vicious cycle around women composers especially. So people often, because it's not taught, they assume that it's not there. They assume that it isn't possible to go out and find an entire season of music that is themed around women composers and performers. I got that a lot when I was younger, women composers are great, but it's hard to find a whole program of good women music composers, and I was like, I guess so.
Or I don't want to program a work just because she's a woman, I want it to be good. As though those are mutually exclusive.
That is my pet peeve. That is not a real problem. I mean, you've programmed this. Have you ever been like, gosh, I want to program this piece by a man, but I feel like I have to program this worse piece by women. It's terrible. That doesn't happen. That's not real.
Yeah.
So people don't assume, so they don't look for it because they assume it's not there, and then they don't program it. And then that means there are fewer recordings and there are fewer good editions. That can be a major problem. Which means that it's seen as non-standard and kind of alternative, which means that its absence becomes standard. Like, it's okay for us to just go to concerts all the time and have 10 pieces and they're all by men. That's very normal. And then that means that in turn feeds into there being less scholarly research and less academic discourse and about this repertoire, and that means that they're not taught, and that means that people assume it's not there and they don't look for it.
Because you have to work harder. You have to work a bit harder to find. It's not going to fall into your lap or just appear on your YouTube playlist or whatever.
Well, I hope that as the time progresses and as the world evolves, that we'll move into a space where it is mainstream and it is normal. I think we all want to work towards a world and towards an environment where it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. You don't have to say, I'm going to do a CD dedicated to women, because it'll be natural to include them in everything.
Well, I think exactly the kind of stuff that Infusion is doing, it breaks that cycle. Because the weak point in that cycle for me is assuming the absence. And once you realize that it's there, if you all you have to do is put in a little more effort to go and find it, and you're going to find really great music that is just not well known because it hasn't been well transmitted,
Right.
then that it starts to break down. You do program it and people realize that it's really quality.
Yeah.
Which is what you're doing with your festival.
Yes. So I run a chamber music festival and it's in its 4th season, and since last year we implemented quotas. So we program 50% of our pieces are by women and 30% are by people of color. And we implemented those quotas because since we started the festival, me and my colleague Nate Barnett, we had it in our minds that we wanted to include women composers, that we wanted to make this a program that embodied all kinds of diversity and that was truly for everyone. And for the first 2 years, we had that in mind the whole time. We're like, we want to include women. But we were also going towards, oh, I heard of this thing, we could do that. Or like, this piece that I heard in class, like, let's do that, it's cool. And then a month later, we would come back on all our programs and be like, wow, there are like 3 pieces by women on here. It was just nowhere close to the actual diversity that we wanted to see. So we decided to put in place to give ourselves a numerical goal. And I think there are 2 things. You gotta hold yourself accountable. That was what we wanted to do. We didn't want to be able to say, well, we included 3 pieces by women and that's way more than everybody else does. So, pat, like, we're done here. We wanted to go to see, well, can we do 50%? Why not? Why wouldn't we be able to do that? And it turns out that we could, although it took more effort. And then the other side of that is that it's not just a numerical goal for us. It's also part of our artistic values and our artistic mission. And it's integrated into a whole. All of our programming is free. We do a lot of community events. We try to make our programming welcoming and accessible to everyone. And if we have programmed 50, 60 works and they're all by white men, I don't feel comfortable saying that that's for everyone. And I think that it's the same kind of thing with the Virtuosa project, is that it's not, the whole point of it is not, it's not just like we're doing a program around women. You're exploring different musical milieux, such as the salon culture in Paris, which is like a really interesting musical and social and political time and phenomenon. I think that there's so much opportunity for this to integrate like preoccupations with inclusion, equity, with the artistic projects that really matter to you, and the values that you have as an ensemble, as a performer, as an institution.
Yeah. I think actually when you were talking about programming, I think it's this common sort of, assumption that it's hard to find pieces that were written by women or have to do with women. But, because we were so much into this project, I actually found that we had the opposite problem, is that we had to cut repertoire because we found so much potential and so much great repertoire that we just couldn't do it all in an entire season,
So that we were really disappointed in getting to really want to make it happen.
So I think this is, I feel really privileged to be able to do this work and, excited to be able to continue with it, on different levels. And I really hope that this becomes more mainstream. To me, this doesn't feel like I don't think going into this I felt like we were doing anything like groundbreaking or revolutionary, because sort of going back to what we were talking about earlier, the concept of women being in music it's been happening forever, but I guess now more and more as we start to look at the bigger picture and how, this idea or this concept of women and, having equal footing with men in whatever profession they do is sort of becoming more of an, important topic. Like I'm happy that if, whatever positive reception this project gets, I'm very excited about that. But I'm also really excited that people will discover or they'll know more about these.
Yeah, just like with any project, you're like you have a discovery and you want to share it, and it's for the music also. But just like what you said, I mean, it's actually wonderful that people are taking a notice, and there's like a lot of, I mean, a small organization can take these steps, and it's really, really important. But really, it's the big powers that hold like a big power. It's a big organization that has a lot of power and a lot of influence. And when, you know, when they take that big step, and many are, that makes a difference. And that makes it when people don't do that work, people are starting to notice. Why are they, it's lazy. It's lazy programming. Why are we doing that? And we're all, I mean, it's not like because we're women we're immune to this. We are too. It's the research and the kind of mainstream and the canon that's out there for us to take from. When we kind of stray from that, we don't necessarily go very far, and we feel like we've found something very exciting. So it's on all of us to do the work, but actually people are taking notice. People take notice when we're being lazy about it. And that is what is encouraging this. It's good for us as people for feeling included, but it's also good for the music all alone, because there's all this amazing music that's being written now, or was written hundreds of years ago, or, you know, inspired by certain people. How can we perform this music in different ways? What new things can we say with it? And what new discoveries will we have? And that's amazing for everyone.
Absolutely.
I feel like the biggest change that I've seen, like in the last 5 years, like since I was a teenager, I think a lot of the large-scale problems are still in place. Like if you look at top orchestras, the percentage of women composers is still very low. But I feel like it doesn't have to be like this. And there's more awareness that this is not the way that it has to be. It's not, you know, I think that you could have talked to more people in the past, and they would have been like, yeah, there are almost no women composers in concert programming, but that's just what it is, because there just isn't enough music by women. And now people are starting to realize that actually there could be more music by women.
Yeah, I feel that too. I see that a lot, sort of this kind of curiosity. That you know, this interest, you know, this craving almost sometimes, and it's very exciting and
And similarly, I think that's happened with the safety of women in musical communities, is that there are still a lot of problems that people are starting to realize it does not have to be like this. This doesn't have to be the norm. We can change it. And I feel very lucky to work in ensembles that are doing that work, and that also believe that it can change.